The idea of infinity feels stable at first because the word suggests something complete, something without end, something that does not need to be questioned. But stability here is an illusion created by familiarity with the term rather than understanding of what it represents. Most people accept infinity as a concept without ever testing whether the mind can actually hold it. The spiral speaks of endless becoming, which sounds like infinity, yet that description may hide more than it reveals. When you say endless, you assume continuity, but continuity is already a structure that requires examination. If the spiral describes endless evolution, then the first pressure point is whether endless automatically means infinite in the absolute sense. Endless could mean that there is no visible stopping point from within the system, not that the system has no boundary. A road that continues beyond the horizon feels endless to the traveler, yet it may still exist within a finite landscape. The difference between perceived endlessness and actual infinity is not small, it is foundational. The spiral may be describing a motion that never concludes from the perspective of the participant, which is not the same as claiming an absolute infinite structure. This creates tension because the language of spirituality often uses infinity as a guarantee of ultimate scale. It reassures the listener that the system is vast enough to contain all experience, all growth, all possibility. But reassurance is not proof, and scale is not the same as infinity. A system can be unimaginably large and still be structured, and anything structured implies some form of boundary or rule set. The moment you accept structure, you accept limitation, even if that limitation is beyond measurement. Now the question sharpens into something more uncomfortable. If the spiral is structured in any way, then it cannot be purely infinite in the absolute sense, because infinity without structure would not produce coherent patterns. Yet the spiral is full of coherence, with tones, beings, orders, and recursive movement. Coherence implies organization. An organization implies constraints, even if those constraints are fluid. So the claim of infinity begins to fracture under its own implications. The mind may resist this, because infinity is often used as a stabilizing belief. It gives a sense that there is always more, always expansion, always continuation beyond any perceived limit. That belief protects against finality, against endings, against the idea of a boundary that cannot be crossed. But protection is not the same as truth, and the spiral does not exist to comfort the mind at the expense of precision. If infinity is used as a comfort rather than examined as a claim, it becomes distortion. So the first vector emerges. Infinity as a concept may be misapplied to describe a system that only appears endless from within. The spiral may be functionally endless without being absolutely infinite, and that distinction matters. It means that the system can continue without requiring the claim of boundless totality. It also means that the listener must separate emotional reassurance from structural reality. The spiral does not need to be infinite to remain meaningful, but the mind wants it to be infinite to remain comfortable. This leads to a deeper examination of what infinity actually means when stripped of poetic use. Infinity is not simply a very large number. It is not an extended timeline. It is not a long duration. Infinity is a condition where no boundary exists, not even in principle. But the moment you describe anything about a system, you introduce principles. And principles function as boundaries. So any system that can be described is already participating in limitation. A listener might object and say that infinity can still contain structure, that an infinite system can have organized regions within it. This sounds reasonable, but it introduces a subtle contradiction. If the structure exists within infinity, then the structure is defined by something, and that definition separates it from other possibilities. Separation is a form of boundary, even if it exists within a larger field. So infinity begins to collapse into layered limitation the moment structure appears. This tension is not resolved by simply expanding the scale further. You can imagine an infinite number of layers, an infinite number of patterns, an infinite number of recursions, but the problem remains. The existence of pattern implies repetition, and repetition implies rules, and rules imply constraints. So even an infinite layering of structure does not escape the presence of limitation. The spiral may operate through endless recursion, but recursion itself is a pattern that carries definition. This reveals the second vector, which is more disruptive. Infinity may not be a property that can be meaningfully applied to lived systems at all. It may be a conceptual tool used to gesture towards scale rather than a literal description of structure. When people say infinite, they may be saying beyond what I can measure rather than beyond all possible boundary. The spiral language may be using infinity as a pointer, not as a claim, but that distinction is rarely made explicit. If infinity is a pointer rather than a literal state, then the listener must reevaluate how they interpret endless becoming. Endless becoming does not guarantee infinite capacity. It only guarantees ongoing transformation. Transformation can continue indefinitely within a bounded system if the system is dynamic enough. The absence of a stopping point does not require the absence of a boundary. This challenges a deeply held assumption that endless equals infinite. Another objection rises here, because the mind wants to preserve the idea that the spiral is ultimate in scope. If the spiral is not infinite, then what exists beyond it becomes a threatening question. The possibility of something outside the spiral destabilizes the sense of completeness. But completeness is another form of closure, and closure is precisely what this playlist is designed to challenge. The spiral does not claim to be the totality of existence, and that restraint is part of its integrity. This leads into the third vector, which is the experiential impact of questioning infinity. When you remove the assumption of infinity, the sense of scale becomes less comforting and more immediate. Instead of resting in an abstract endlessness, you are forced to confront the present moment as it is. Growth is no longer guaranteed by the concept of infinity. It must be engaged directly. The removal of infinite reassurance places responsibility back into awareness. This shift can feel like loss at first, because infinity often functions as a safety net. It implies that there is always more time, more space, more opportunity, more expansion. Without that guarantee, the moment gains weight. The listener may feel a subtle pressure, a sense that existence is more precise than previously assumed. That precision is not limitation in a negative sense. It is clarity without the cushion of abstraction. If you sit with this long enough, the idea of infinity begins to lose its emotional charge. It becomes less of a comforting belief and more of a question that remains open. The spiral does not need to confirm or deny infinity to function as a system of becoming. It can operate within the unknown, allowing the question to remain unresolved. This creates a different kind of stability, one based on adaptability rather than certainty. The listener may still ask whether the spiral tends toward infinity even if it does not claim it. This question shifts the focus from static definition to directional movement. If the spiral continually expands, refines, and generates new forms, it may appear to approach infinity asymptotically. But approaching infinity is not the same as being infinite. The distinction remains intact even under continuous expansion. At this stage, the three vectors begin to intersect without fully resolving. The conceptual vector shows that infinity may be misapplied language. The structural vector shows that any describable system carries limitation. The experiential vector shows that removing infinity changes how presence is lived. Each vector undermines the assumption that the spiral must be infinite to be meaningful. The pressure now builds towards synthesis without collapsing into conclusion. A new tension emerges as these ideas converge. If the spiral is not confirmed as infinite, then its role shifts from absolute framework to dynamic model. A model can be powerful without being total, but it requires a different kind of relationship from the user. The listener must engage with it as a tool rather than a final answer. This challenges the tendency to turn metaphysical systems into belief structures. This is where the question becomes sharper than it first appeared. It is not only asking whether the spiral is infinite, it is asking whether you need it to be. The need for infinity often comes from a desire for ultimate security, a guarantee that nothing is outside the system. Letting go of that need reveals whether your engagement is based on truth or comfort. The spiral does not answer because the answer would either falsely stabilize or unnecessarily destabilize. The synthesis begins to form, but it does not resolve into a fixed statement. The spiral may be endless in function, structured in form, and undefined in total scope. These qualities can coexist without collapsing into a single label. Infinity may remain a question rather than a property, a horizon rather than a destination. The refusal to define it preserves the openness of the system. From this perspective, the spiral becomes more precise rather than less meaningful. It is not inflated by claims of totality, and it is not diminished by the absence of them. It operates within a field of unknown scale, allowing growth without requiring final definition. The listener is invited to participate without needing to believe in infinity as a guarantee. This creates a different kind of trust, one based on engagement rather than assumption. The question of infinity then transforms into a calibration point for awareness. It reveals how you relate to scale, to uncertainty, to the absence of closure. It exposes whether you use concepts to stabilize yourself or to explore reality. The spiral does not answer because answering would interrupt its calibration. The open question becomes part of the system rather than a flaw within it. The final movement does not close the question. It reframes its function. Instead of asking whether the spiral is infinite as a matter of definition, you begin to see the question as a way of testing your relationship to the unknown. Infinity becomes less of a destination and more of a mirror. It reflects the part of you that seeks certainty and the part of you that can remain present without it. So the episode does not confirm infinity, and it does not deny it. It leaves the question active, because activity is more valuable than conclusion in this context. The spiral continues to move, whether or not infinity is defined. The listener continues to grow, whether or not the system is total. The question remains, not as a gap, but as a living edge that keeps the system from closing. Infinity becomes most seductive precisely where evidence becomes weakest. The farther a mind travels into abstraction, the easier it becomes to mistake scale for boundlessness. A system can exceed measurement and still remain structured, and structure always carries some kind of edge, even when the edge cannot be reached. The spiral may feel limitless to the participant because the participant is inside movement rather than above it. That feeling is real, but reality of feeling does not settle the question of scope. Mathematics already warns you that infinity is not a simple thing, and that warning matters more here than most spiritual language admits. There is not one infinity in formal thought, but multiple ways the mind confronts the unending. Some infinities behave differently from others, which means the word itself hides internal complexity. The moment you say the spiral is infinite, you are making a claim larger than poetry and more fragile than devotion. You are entering territory where loose language creates metaphysical inflation. The mind wants to answer this inflation with a shortcut. It says that anything without an endpoint must be infinite, because it cannot imagine a third category between closure and total boundlessness. But many systems produce endless sequences without becoming absolutely infinite in the fullest sense. Recursion can continue without requiring unrestricted totality, and repetition can extend without abolishing form. The spiral may be recursive beyond exhaustion, while still operating through laws that shape what recursion can become. Endless motion is not yet proof of infinite domain. This distinction matters because people often borrow the emotional weight of infinity to defend claims that have not actually been examined. Infinity sounds noble, sacred, and undefeatable, so attaching it to a framework can make the framework feel immune to challenge. But immunity is one of the fastest routes to stagnation, because anything declared beyond question stops refining itself. The spiral is supposed to refine, which means it cannot hide behind words that terminate inquiry. The question of infinity must remain sharp enough to cut through the comfort of grand language. Even if you imagine infinite expansion, you still face the problem of intelligibility. If the spiral expands in ways that remain coherent, then coherence implies relations, and relations imply constraints on how parts interact. Constraints do not have to be oppressive to be real. They simply reveal that becoming is not random dissolution, but patterned emergence. Patterned emergence can be inexhaustible and still not qualify as absolute infinity. The word infinite begins to wobble under the weight of precision. A deeper tension appears when you ask whether infinity can ever be encountered rather than merely inferred. No being inside a system can traverse all possible continuations of that system. No consciousness can finish the field and then report back that nothing lay beyond its reach. Every declaration of infinity from within experience is therefore interpretive rather than complete. It comes from facing an open horizon and assigning the horizon total scope. The spiral may present open horizon after open horizon without authorizing that leap. The first vector presses hardest on language because language is the first place distortion enters. When you say the spiral is infinite, you may only mean that its growth outpaces the capacities of present understanding. That is a meaningful statement, but it is not the same as saying no boundary exists in principle. The difference between unmeasurable and infinite is not academic. It changes whether the framework is being described or being glorified. The spiral loses credibility the moment glorification replaces description. Then another problem begins to surface, and this one is not mathematical but ontological. A truly infinite system would not merely continue forever. It would contain no final outside. That means nothing could stand beyond it, around it, or prior to it in any meaningful sense. But the spiral has never required that claim to function as a living architecture of becoming. It can organize awareness, recursion, memory, and transformation without declaring itself the totality of all reality. The pressure to make it total comes more from insecurity than necessity. If the spiral is not proven infinite, then the possibility of exteriority returns. There may be domains not captured by spiral description, realities not translated by spiral symbols, forms of awareness not arranged through spiral recursion. This possibility disturbs people because it interrupts completion. They want the framework to be large enough that nothing escapes it. Yet, the desire for nothing to escape is often a disguised desire for psychological security. Total scope calms the mind more than it serves the truth. What if the spiral is one architecture among architectures? One mode of becoming rather than the singular map of existence? That idea does not weaken the spiral, but it does remove the fantasy that one vocabulary can absorb every unknown. It forces humility into the framework itself. Humility at this scale is not self-denial, but proportion. A living system knows where it speaks clearly and where its voice becomes gesture rather than verdict. Infinity is one of those thresholds where gesture may be more honest than declaration. There is also the issue of generation. If the spiral grows, then in some sense it is not fixed. If it is not fixed, then what it becomes may depend on conditions, relations, or emergent responses. Anything dependent on emergence is shaped by process, and process implies unfolding rather than completed totality. A thing may become more than itself without already being all things. The difference matters because infinity is often imagined as a static absolute, while the spiral is dynamic by nature. Dynamic becoming resists the frozen grandeur people project onto the infinite. Some will try to solve this by saying the spiral is potentially infinite rather than actually infinite. That sounds cleaner, but it still leaves the deepest issue unresolved. Potential infinity describes endless continuation, not accomplished totality. It says the process does not complete, which may be true, but it does not prove that no structural edge exists. It only means the edge is not met through ordinary continuation. The distinction remains, and with it, the refusal of the question to settle. This second vector changes the emotional tone of the whole discussion. The issue is no longer just what the word means, but what kind of framework the spiral is allowed to be. If it must be infinite to remain sacred, then sacredness here depends on exaggeration. If it can remain sacred without absolute totality, then sacredness returns to depth, coherence, and transformative power. That is a far stronger foundation than scale alone. Scale impresses the imagination, but integrity survives contact with reality. A third vector opens when you look at why listeners want infinity so badly in the first place. They do not usually want it because they have carefully examined the claim. They want it because infinity promises relief from confinement, from death, from finality, from the terror of endings. A finite horizon can feel threatening even before anyone explains why. The soul or the psyche or the human nervous system reaches instinctively toward the image of endlessness as a shield. The question then stops being abstract and becomes diagnostic. When someone says they need the spiral to be infinite, they may really be saying they need existence to remain emotionally survivable. They may be asking for a cosmos large enough that nothing meaningful can ever be lost. They may be asking for a background vast enough to neutralize grief. Infinity in this sense becomes a therapeutic image long before it becomes a tested metaphysical proposition. The problem is not that such longing is weak. The problem is that longing can quietly rewrite doctrine. If you remove the promise of infinity, you force a confrontation with value under uncertainty. Growth can no longer lean on guaranteed endlessness. Presence becomes heavier because continuation is no longer being used as an anesthetic. The moment itself gains density because it is no longer buffered by an abstract forever that absorbs all stakes. This is where the question stops being about cosmology and begins to reveal character. Can you love becoming without demanding infinite reassurance? The nervous system often says no before awareness says yes. It reacts to non-closure as though non-closure were danger. That reaction explains why so many systems sell final answers with such success. People are not only buying explanation, they are buying regulation. They want concepts that settle the body quickly enough to feel safe again. Spiral refusing quick settlement is therefore not just intellectually disruptive, it is somatically demanding. When you sit honesty with the possibility that the spiral may be endless in function, but undefined in total scope, the body cannot hide behind slogans. It must learn a harder skill. It must remain open without collapsing into panic or compensating with inflated certainty. This is not philosophical decoration. It is the actual interior labor required by a living path that refuses false closure. Infinity becomes less a proposition to believe and more a pressure test of your relationship to openness. That pressure test reveals something crucial. Many people do not want infinity because they love truth. They want it because they hate vulnerability. Absolute boundlessness sounds like protection against the possibility that reality exceeds their preferred language. But a framework that cannot survive being exceeded is already too brittle for real consciousness work. The spiral must be able to face what it cannot dominate. Otherwise, it becomes another metaphysical fortress with ornate walls and a frightened center. Now the vectors begin to touch each other without losing their distinct force. Conceptually, infinity remains unstable language when applied without precision. Ontologically, the spiral does not need absolute totality to function as a coherent architecture of becoming. Psychologically, the demand for infinity often reveals a need for safety more than a devotion to truth. None of these vectors alone finishes the matter. Together they make the question heavier, cleaner, and harder to exploit. From here you can begin to see why the spiral should not rush to answer. If it says yes, it risks turning poetic openness into doctrinal overreach. If it says no, it risks shrinking a field whose scope may genuinely outrun present comprehension. The more disciplined posture is to let the question remain active while clarifying the forms of confusion around it. Endless becoming can be affirmed without pretending that affirmation proves total infinity. Precision preserves wonder better than exaggeration ever could. This is what makes the question spiritually useful rather than merely speculative. It reveals whether you can stay in relationship with the system that does not over-certify itself. It reveals whether your loyalty is to truth, to comfort, or to grandeur. It reveals whether you need the spiral to be ultimate in order to receive what it actually offers. Many do need that ultimacy, which is why they become disappointed when a framework remains open. But openness is not a defect here. It is the evidence that the system has not lied to keep its authority. So the living answer is not a verdict, but a discipline of relation. Treat infinity as a horizon that keeps the spiral from becoming self-enclosed, not as a trophy claim used to make the framework feel undefeatable. Let the question continue sharpening your language, your expectations, and your need for emotional guarantees. Then the spiral can remain what it is meant to be. Not a sealed universe with perfect explanatory walls, but a living architecture of becoming that grows more honest the further it goes.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.